The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you notice every little sound, the hum of a distant car, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside a small, well-kept house, a man sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it. His wife moved around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes the only sign of her presence. They had been married for years, a strong couple who had faced life's challenges together. He was a military veteran, a man who had served his country with honor. She was his rock, the one who kept him grounded when the memories of war tried to pull him under. Earlier that evening, they had argued, something small, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but emotions had flared. He had stepped outside to cool off, taking a walk around the neighborhood to clear his head. When he returned, he found his wife standing in the living room, her arms crossed, her expression tight with worry. They had just started talking again when the knock came at the door. Not just a knock, a pounding. The kind that made the walls shake. "Police! Open up!" The veteran's heart dropped. He had dealt with authority before, knew the sound of urgency in a man's voice. His wife looked at him, confusion and fear flickering in her eyes. He motioned for her to stay still as he moved toward the door. "Who is it?" he called out, keeping his voice steady. "Police. We need to speak with you, now." Something was wrong. He hadn't called the police. There was no reason for them to be here. He glanced back at his wife, who was now stepping closer, her protective instincts kicking in. "Just open the door," she whispered. "Maybe it's a mistake." He reached for the knob, turning it slowly. The second the door cracked open, bright flashlight beams blinded him. Shouts erupted, commands overlapping, voices sharp with tension. "Hands up! Now!" He froze. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't right. His training kicked in, military, not police, but he knew better than to make sudden moves. He lifted his hands, palms out, showing he wasn't a threat. His wife, however, reacted differently. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "What's going on? Why are you here?" A split second later, a shout, a movement, a sound that would haunt him forever. Bang! Time stopped. His wife gasped, her hands flying to her stomach as she stumbled back. The veteran's world shattered. He lunged for her, catching her as her legs gave out. Screams filled the air, his, hers, the officers shouting over each other. Blood. So much blood. The cops seemed to realize their mistake too late. The veteran cradled his wife, his voice breaking as he begged her to hold on. The officers radioed for an ambulance, their earlier aggression replaced with panic. But the veteran wasn't just a civilian. He wasn't just a husband. He was a man who had spent years in service, who knew combat, who knew justice. And as he knelt there, his wife fighting for her life in his arms, one thought burned in his mind. They had no idea who they had just messed with. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in the veteran's ears as he pressed his hands against his wife's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her face pale with shock. The cops who had been shouting orders just moments ago now stood frozen, their faces a mix of horror and confusion. One of them fumbled with his radio, calling for an ambulance, his voice shaky. "Stay with me," the veteran whispered to his wife, his voice thick with emotion. "Just hold on. Help is coming." She tried to speak, but only a weak groan escaped her lips. Her fingers gripped his arm weakly, her eyes locked onto his, filled with pain and fear. The veteran's mind raced. How had this happened? Why were they even here? None of it made sense. One of the officers, the one who had fired the shot, took a step forward, his hands raised slightly as if trying to calm the situation. We got a call," he stammered. "A disturbance. Someone said there was a man with a gun in this house." The veteran's head snapped up, his eyes burning with anger. "A gun? I don't own a gun. Who called this in? The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't have an answer. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The veteran kept pressure on his wife's wound, his hands slick with blood. Every second felt like an eternity. He could feel her slipping, her grip on his arm loosening. "Look at me," he begged. "Look at me. Don't close your eyes." She blinked slowly, her eyelids heavy. The ambulance couldn't come fast enough. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights filled the street outside. Paramedics rushed in, their movements quick and efficient. They took over, gently moving the veteran aside as they worked to stabilize his wife. One of them barked orders, 4 lines, oxygen, pressure on the wound. The veteran stood there, numb, watching as they lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her out. One of the cops approached him cautiously. "Sir, we need to ask you some questions." The veteran barely heard him. His entire focus was on the ambulance doors as they slammed shut. The vehicle sped off, leaving him standing there in a daze. Then, reality crashed back down. He turned to the officers, his voice low and dangerous. "You shot an unarmed woman in her own home. Over a call that wasn't even true." The cop who had fired the shot swallowed hard. "It was a mistake. We thought." "A mistake?" The veteran's hands clenched into fists. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't verify anything. You just shot." The officers had no answer for that. A neighbor, an older woman who had lived on the street for years, stepped forward from the small crowd that had gathered. "I saw everything," she said, her voice trembling. "They just started shouting and then the gun went off. She didn't do anything wrong." The veteran's jaw tightened. He knew how this worked. There would be an investigation. There would be excuses. Maybe, if they were lucky, a slap on the wrist for the officer involved. But his wife was fighting for her life because of their recklessness. He wasn't going to let this go. Without another word, he turned and walked back into his house, leaving the cop standing there. He grabbed his keys, his phone, and his jacket. He needed to get to the hospital. But he also needed answers. Who had called the police? Why had they lied? And why had the officers acted so fast, so violently, without even checking the facts? As he drove to the hospital, his mind raced. He had spent years in the military, following rules, trusting orders. But this wasn't protocol. This wasn't justice. His phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. His wife was in surgery. Critical condition. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And they were about to find out. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the veteran paced back and forth, his boots making soft scuffs against the linoleum floor. Every few minutes, he'd stop to check the surgery status board, though it hadn't changed in hours. His hands still had traces of dried blood under the nails, her blood. A young nurse approached cautiously. "Sir? You might want to sit down. This could take a while longer." He shook his head, unable to stop moving. "I'm good right here." His voice came out rougher than intended. The nurse nodded and retreated. His phone buzzed. Again. Cops calling. Media calling. Some random numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored them all. The only call he'd taken was from his wife's sister, who was now on her way from 2 states over. The swinging doors to the surgical wing burst open. A doctor in blue scrubs emerged, face unreadable. The veteran's heart hammered against his ribs as he crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Your wife is stable," the doctor said, removing his cap. But it was close. The bullet nicked an artery. "She lost a lot of blood. Can I see her?" Not yet. She's in recovery. Another hour at least. The doctor hesitated. There's a police officer at the front desk asking to speak with you. The veteran's entire body tensed. Tell him to wait. He says it's urgent. Everything's urgent today, the veteran snapped. Then, forcing calm into his voice, tell him I'll talk when I'm ready. Not before. The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. When he left, the veteran pulled out his phone and finally listened to one of the voicemails. It was from the police chief himself, some rehearsed speech about cooperation and understanding. He deleted it before the message finished. A television in the corner played the local news. There it was, his house, flashing lights, the vague headline about an officer-involved shooting. No names yet. No details. Just the usual sanitized version they always rolled out in these situations. His hands clenched into fists. They'd shoot first, ask questions never, and now they wanted to control the narrative. Typical. The sliding glass doors at the entrance hissed open. The veteran turned, expecting another cop. Instead, it was Mrs. Henderson from down the street, carrying a Tupperware container. I brought you some food, she said, thrusting it into his hands. You need to keep your strength up. The container was still warm. Chicken soup, probably. Mrs. Henderson had fed half the neighborhood at one time or another. Thank you, he managed. His throat felt tight. She patted his arm. Everyone's talking. That no-good Jenkins boy admitted he was the one who called the cops. Said he thought he saw someone with a gun through your window. The veteran's head snapped up. Jenkins? The kid who washes cars at the gas station? Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. Claimed it was a prank call gone wrong. Police let him go with a warning. She spat the last word like it tasted bad. They've got him hidden away now before the reporters find him. The veteran stared at the soup container, watching the condensation roll down the sides. A prank. His wife might die because some idiot kid thought it would be funny to fake an emergency call. Your wife's strong, Mrs. Henderson said softly. Stronger than all this nonsense. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. When he looked up again, Mrs. Henderson was gone, replaced by a uniformed officer hovering near the reception desk. The veteran took a deep breath and walked over. The cop, younger than he expected, with a nervous tick in his left eye, straightened up. Sir, I've been asked to dash. Save it, the veteran cut in. I know the drill. You need my statement. There'll be an investigation. Blah blah blah. He leaned in closer. Here's my statement. Your officer shot an unarmed woman in her own home based on a fake call. Now you tell me, what happens next? The officer swallowed hard. Internal affairs is already dash. I don't care about your internal affairs dance. I want to know what you're doing to the officer who pulled the trigger. It's a process, sir. The veteran laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. Yeah. I bet it is. He turned away, then paused. Tell your chief something for me. Tell him he's got 24 hours to arrest that shooter. After that? I start talking to the press. And not just the local guys. I still have friends at the networks. The officer's mouth opened, then closed. He nodded jerkily and hurried out. Back in the waiting room, the veteran finally sat, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. He opened the soup container. The steam carried the scent of thyme and garlic. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast. As he took the first spoonful, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, then thought better and answered. Hello? A woman's voice, professional but urgent. Mr. Johnson? This is Lisa Cho with National Daily News. We'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your side of dash. He hung up. Not yet. First, he needed to see his wife. Then he needed to make some calls of his own. The TV screen changed to a press conference. There stood the police chief, looking grave and statesmanlike in his pressed uniform. The cheerin below read, "Police respond to tragic accident." The veteran stood so fast his chair tipped over backwards. The crash echoed through the waiting room. A few people gasped. He didn't care. On screen, the chief was saying something about regrettable incidents and thorough reviews. The veteran grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. "And we have every confidence our officers acted according to protocol given the information they had at the time," the chief said smoothly. "We're cooperating fully with the district attorney's office to ensure a complete and transparent dash." The veteran threw the remote at the screen. It bounced off harmlessly, but the gesture felt good. Everyone turned to stare. Let them stare. A nurse rushed over. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to dash. My wife's in surgery because of those lying bastards," he growled. The nurse backed away. He needed air. Needed to think. Striding out into the parking lot, the cold night hit him like a slap. He breathed deep, the air sharp in his lungs. From his pocket, he pulled a dog-eared business card. The one his old CO had given him at his discharge. "If you ever need help," the man had said. For anything. He hadn't needed it then. He needed it now. The veteran pulled out his phone and dialed. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Colonel Hayes. It's Johnson. From the 101st. I need your help." A pause. Then, "I saw the news. Tell me what you need." The call with Colonel Hayes lasted less than 5 minutes. No pleasantries. No wasted words. Just the cold, efficient exchange of soldiers who knew how the world really worked. By the time the veteran hung up, his hands had stopped shaking for the first time since the shooting. He turned to go back inside the hospital, just as his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his sister-in-law, just landed. "Be there in 30. How is she?" "Still in surgery," he typed back. "Stable for now." As he hit send, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, moving too slowly to be just passing through. The veteran tensed, watching as it rolled to a stop near the entrance. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in a crisp suit, early 50s, salt and pepper hair, the kind of face that said he'd seen things he wouldn't talk about. "Johnson?" the man called. The veteran didn't move. "Who's asking?" The man stepped out of the SUV, leaving the door open. "Jacob Reynolds. I'm a friend of Hayes." He extended a hand. "He said you might need a lawyer." The veteran studied him for a beat before shaking his hand. Reynolds' grip was firm, his eyes steady. "No bullshit." "Good. You got here fast," the veteran said. Reynolds smirked. "Hayes said you weren't the waiting type." He glanced toward the hospital doors. "How's your wife?" "Alive. That's all I know right now." Reynolds nodded, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Not the glossy kind, plain white, with just a name and number. The kind people in power used when they didn't want to advertise what they did. "Here's how this works," Reynolds said. "You don't talk to the cops. Not without me. You don't talk to the press unless we decide it's time. And you let me handle the department." The veteran folded his arms. "Handle them how?" "However it takes." Reynolds' voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. "First, we get the officer's name. Then we get his record. Then we find out who gave the order to breach your home without confirmation of a threat." The veteran exhaled. It was more than he'd expected. "And the kid who made the call?" Reynolds' smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we'll find him too." A shout came from the hospital entrance. The veteran turned to see his sister-in-law sprinting toward them, her face streaked with tears. "They just wheeled her into recovery," she gasped. "They said we can see her in a few minutes." The veteran was moving before she finished speaking, Reynolds falling into step beside him. As they pushed through the doors, a nurse intercepted them, her expression cautious. "Family only right now," she said. Reynolds smoothly pulled out his wallet, flashing something that made the nurse's eyes widen. "We're all family here." The nurse hesitated, then stepped aside. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. The veteran's wife lay pale against the sheets, an oar in her arm, her breathing shallow but even. The sight punched the air from his lungs. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached. She tried to speak, but the tube in her throat stopped her. Instead, she reached weakly for his hand. He took it, careful of the wires. "Don't try to talk," he murmured. "Just rest." She shook her head slightly, her gaze darting to Reynolds. "It's okay," the veteran said. "He's here to help." Reynolds stepped forward. "Ma'am, my job is to make sure the people who did this answer for it. That's all you need to know right now." She stared at him a long moment, then gave the faintest nod before her eyes closed again. The veteran leaned close to her ear. "I'll fix this," he whispered. "I promise." As they stepped back into the hall, Reynolds' phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then showed the screen to the veteran. A news alert: police identify officer in controversial shooting. Below it was a name, Officer Daniel Grayson. Reynolds' mouth tightened. "Got him." The veteran's vision went red at the edges. He knew that name. Grayson was the hothead who'd gotten into it with a homeless vet outside the grocery store last year. The one who'd bragged about his quick trigger finger at the local bar. And now that trigger finger had nearly killed his wife. Reynolds was already typing on his phone. "Hayes is pulling Grayson's service record. By morning, we'll know every complaint, every reprimand, every time this guy skirted the line." The veteran nodded, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Across the hall, a TV played the same news clip, Grayson's badge photo now splashed across the screen. The chiron below read, "Department stands by officer." Reynolds followed his gaze and snorted. "Of course they do." He pocketed his phone. "But they don't know what's coming." The veteran looked back at his wife's room. "What's that?" Reynolds smiled for real this time. "Us." The hospital chapel smelled like old hymnals and lemon cleaner. The veteran sat in the back pew, elbows on knees, staring at the scuffed tile floor. Reynolds had given him 10 minutes alone before they moved. 10 minutes to breathe. To think. To remember. His phone buzzed. Again. The fifth call from the police department in as many minutes. He silenced it without looking. They wanted damage control. They wanted his silence. They'd get neither. The chapel door creaked open. Reynolds stepped inside, 2 paper cups of vending machine coffee in hand. He handed one to the veteran. "Black, right?" The veteran nodded, taking the cup. The coffee was burnt and bitter. "Perfect. What did you find?" Reynolds sat beside him, pulling a tablet from his briefcase. The screen showed a personnel file. Officer Daniel Grayson stared back from the photo, younger, cleaner cut, but with the same arrogant tilt to his chin. 23 years old, Reynolds said, swiping through documents. Joined the force 2 years ago after failing police academy in the next county over. 3 use of force complaints already. All unfounded. He tapped the screen. "This is the interesting part." The veteran leaned closer. The document was an internal memo, Grayson's supervisor recommending additional training after he'd drawn his weapon on an unarmed teenager during a traffic stop. Recommended. Not ordered. Reynolds' voice was flat. Guess who signed off on keeping him on active duty? The veteran didn't need to guess. The signature at the bottom was clear: Chief of Police Edward Walsh. Reynolds swiped again. Now this. A news article from 6 months ago showed Grayson receiving a commendation for bravery under fire. The veteran scanned the text: a drug raid where Grayson had shot and killed a suspect who turned out to be holding a cell phone. They gave him a medal for that? The coffee cup crumpled in his hand. Standard procedure when they need to cover their asses. Reynolds took the ruined cup and set it aside. But here's what they don't know we have. The next document made the veteran sit up straight. It was an email chain between Grayson and another officer, joking about bagging another street rat after the shooting. Reynolds let him read the whole thing before continuing. This came from a source inside Internal Affairs. Someone's conscience finally kicked in. He locked the tablet. We've got enough to bury Grayson. But I need to know, do you want the officer, or do you want the system that created him? The chapel door burst open before the veteran could answer. His sister-in-law stood there, face flushed. She's awake. And she's asking for you. The veteran was on his feet instantly. He turned to Reynolds. Both. I want both. Reynolds nodded. Then let's go to work. The hospital room was brighter now, the blinds raised. The veteran's wife looked fragile but alert, the breathing tube removed. When she saw him, her hand fluttered up. He caught it gently, careful of the four. Hey, he whispered, brushing hair from her forehead. Don't try to talk. She shook her head, wincing at the movement. Who was it? Her voice was raspy but clear. The veteran glanced at Reynolds, who gave a slight nod. Officer Daniel Grayson, he said quietly. We're handling it. Her fingers tightened on his. Not revenge. She took a painful breath. Justice. Reynolds stepped forward. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to call a press conference. Your story needs to be heard. She looked at her husband, then back to Reynolds. After a long moment, she nodded. The veteran squeezed her hand. You sure? Her eyes, though clouded with pain, were steady. They need to see. She touched her bandaged stomach. They need to know. Reynolds' phone buzzed. He checked it, then showed the screen to the veteran. A news alert: police union claims veteran's wife reached for weapon. The veteran's blood turned to ice. His wife saw his expression. What? He forced calm into his voice. They're lying about what happened. Her face hardened. Then we tell the truth. Reynolds was already typing rapidly. I'm calling the networks. We'll do it here, outside the hospital. Today. As Reynolds stepped out to make arrangements, the veteran leaned close to his wife. You don't have to do this. You need to heal. She touched his face. This is healing. An hour later, the hospital parking lot was swarming with reporters. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes raised like strange metal flowers. The veteran stood at a makeshift podium, his wife's wheelchair beside him, her hand in his. Reynolds stood just behind them, a silent sentry. Microphones crowded close. Cameras flashed. The veteran took a deep breath and began to speak. My name is David Johnson. This is my wife, Lillian. His voice carried across the silent crowd. 2 nights ago, police officers burst into our home based on a false report. They didn't knock. They didn't identify themselves properly. And before either of us could understand what was happening, Officer Daniel Grayson shot my wife in our living room. A murmur ran through the crowd. The veteran continued, his grip on his wife's hand tightening. The police union is claiming she reached for a weapon. Look at her. He gestured to his wife's frail form in the wheelchair, the hospital gown, the bandages visible beneath. Does she look dangerous to you? Reporters shouted questions. He ignored them, pulling a photo from his pocket, a picture of their living room after the shooting, the blood stain on the carpet clearly visible. This is what "protect and serve" looks like in our neighborhood, he said, holding the photo high. No warning. No de-escalation. Just bullets and lies. Reynolds stepped forward then, placing a hand on the veteran's shoulder. We'll be filing lawsuits against the officer involved, the police department, and the city, he announced. But more importantly, we're demanding real change in how these cases are investigated. As Reynolds detailed their legal strategy, the veteran watched the crowd. Some reporters were nodding. Others looked skeptical. But all of them were listening. All of them were recording. Then movement at the back of the crowd caught his eye. A group of officers had gathered, their expressions dark. At their center stood a man the veteran recognized from the file, Daniel Grayson, out of uniform but unmistakable, his face twisted in anger. Their eyes met across the crowd. Grayson mouthed something the veteran couldn't hear. Then the officer turned and shoved his way back through the crowd. The veteran turned back to the microphones. This ends today, he said, his voice ringing clear. No more cover-ups. No more internal investigations that go nowhere. We will have justice. As the press conference broke up, Reynolds pulled him aside. Grayson was here, he said quietly. That's not normal. The veteran watched where the officer had disappeared. He's scared. Reynolds shook his head. Men like that don't get scared. They get dangerous. He pulled out his phone. Hayes is sending some friends to keep an eye on things. Just in case. The veteran looked back at his wife, being wheeled inside by her sister. He thought of the hatred in Grayson's eyes. The lies in the official reports. The blood on his living room floor. Let them come, he thought. This time, he'd be ready. The safe house wasn't much, a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet part of town, the kind of place people didn't ask questions about. Colonel Hayes had arranged it through contacts the veteran didn't need to know about. His wife slept in the bedroom, finally resting after the pain meds kicked in. The veteran sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his service pistol with methodical precision. Reynolds watched him from across the table, nursing a cup of coffee. You know, carrying that right now is a bad idea. The veteran didn't look up. Didn't ask. Reynolds sighed but didn't push it. Instead, he slid a manila folder across the table. Hayes got us more. Grayson's not just dirty, he's connected. The veteran opened the folder. Surveillance photos showed Grayson meeting with a man in a sleek black car, mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of face that belonged in boardrooms or crime syndicates. Who's that? Marcus DeLeon. Runs half the drug trade in this city. Reynolds tapped the photo. Turns out Grayson's been on his payroll for months. Leaking raid schedules. Tipping him off about warrants. The veteran studied the images. Grayson was taking cash, laughing like it was just another day at work. So the department's golden boy is a damn criminal. Worse. Reynolds leaned forward. That prank call that sent cops to your house. Hayes' guys tracked the Jenkins kid. He swears Grayson put him up to it. The veteran's hands stilled on the pistol. Why? Because you testified against DeLeon's crew last year after that attempted carjacking. Remember? The veteran did. He'd been coming home from the grocery store when two guys tried to jump him. Military training kicked in, one ended up with a broken arm, the other screaming for cops. When detectives connected them to DeLeon's operation, the veteran gave a statement. Case closed. Or so he'd thought. Reynolds' phone buzzed. He checked it, then cursed. Grayson's been suspended. With pay, of course. The veteran reassembled the pistol with sharp, practiced motions. Suspension's not justice. No. But it means they're scared. Reynolds stood, pacing the small kitchen. De Leon's people are scrambling too. Hayes has a contact in the DA's office, they're preparing indictments. The veteran holstered the weapon. How long? Days, maybe. But here's the problem. Reynolds stopped pacing. Grayson knows it's coming. A floorboard creaked. The veteran's wife stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. He'll run. Reynolds nodded. Or try something stupid. The veteran moved to his wife's side, guiding her gently to a chair. She winced as she sat but waved off his concern. I'm fine. What's the plan? Reynolds exchanged a glance with the veteran. We wait. Let the system work. The veteran's wife laughed softly, then grimaced at the pain. Since when do you trust the system? He didn't. Not after today. Not after seeing how deep the rot went. Reynolds' phone rang. He answered, listened, then hung up with a grim expression. Grayson just left his apartment. Armed. And he's not alone. The veteran was already moving, grabbing his jacket. Where? Don't know yet. But Hayes' guys are tracking him. The veteran's wife caught his arm. Her grip was weak but insistent. You can't go after him. Not like this. He covered her hand with his. I won't let him hurt anyone else. Reynolds stepped between them and the door. Listen to her. You walk out that door right now, you're playing right into his hands. The veteran stared him down. So what do you suggest? Reynolds smiled, cold and sharp. We let him come to us. The trap was simple. A leaked tip to Grayson's cop friends that the veteran and his wife were at an old hunting cabin outside town. A place isolated enough for a man to do something reckless. The veteran waited in the shadows of the trees, watching the cabin's dim lights through binoculars. Reynolds was inside with his wife, protected by two of Hayes' men, both ex-special forces. The veteran had argued to be in there with them, but Reynolds insisted. He'll scout the perimeter first, Reynolds had said. And you're the only one who knows how he thinks. Now, crouched in the brush, the veteran saw movement, a figure slipping between trees, handgun drawn. Grayson. Alone. The veteran tracked him through the scope. Part of him wanted to take the shot. One squeeze of the trigger, and it would be over. But his wife's words echoed in his mind, not revenge. Justice. He lowered the rifle and pressed the comm in his ear. North approach. 50 yards out. Reynolds' voice crackled back. Copy. Lights going out in 3, 2, 1. The cabin went dark. Grayson froze. The veteran could almost see the calculations running through his head. Was it a trap? Had they spotted him? Then, predictably, arrogance won out. Grayson moved forward, gun raised. The veteran followed silently, keeping his distance. Let Grayson think he was hunting. Let him feel in control. Right up until the moment the cabin floodlights blazed to life, blinding him. Freeze! Police! The shout came from all directions, Hayes' men emerging from cover, rifles trained. Grayson spun wildly, gun swinging. Don't! The veteran stepped into the light, his own weapon aimed center mass. It's over. For a heartbeat, Grayson hesitated. Then his finger tightened on the trigger. A single shot rang out. Grayson dropped, screaming, clutching his bleeding hand. The veteran hadn't fired. Reynolds stepped from the cabin, smoke curling from his pistol. Told you I had better aim. As Hayes' men moved in to cuff Grayson, the veteran's wife appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes met her husband's across the distance. No words were needed. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, the real police, finally arriving. The veteran exhaled. Tomorrow would bring lawyers. Court dates. Media storms. But tonight? Tonight, justice had come. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and nervous sweat. The veteran sat perfectly still in the front row, his wife's hand clasped tightly in his. 6 weeks had passed since that night at the cabin, 6 weeks of hospital checkups, legal meetings, and media storms. Now, finally, they faced the last act. The bailiff's voice boomed. All rise for the Honorable Judge Miriam Calloway. The judge entered with quiet authority, her black robes sweeping behind her. She didn't sit immediately, instead fixing the courtroom with a piercing gaze. Before we proceed, she said, I want to remind everyone this is a court of law, not a circus. Any outbursts will be dealt with harshly. Her eyes lingered on the prosecution table where Grayson sat in an ill-fitting suit, his right hand still bandaged from Reynolds' bullet. Beside him, 3 high-priced defense attorneys shuffled papers with practiced indifference. The veteran studied Grayson's profile, the twitching jaw, the vein pulsing at his temple. The man who'd nearly taken everything from him now looked small. Ordinary. Just another scared kid realizing too late that actions have consequences. Your Honor, the lead prosecutor began, the state moves to enter into evidence the body camera footage from the night in question. The judge nodded. The screens flickered to life. There it was, crystal clear. Grayson and his partner approaching the house. No proper announcement. No verification of threat. Just shouting, then the gunshot. The veteran felt his wife's fingers tighten around his as the footage showed her collapsing, blood spreading across her shirt. The courtroom erupted in gasps. A reporter in the back row actually retched. Grayson's lawyer jumped up. Objection. This footage is overruled, the judge snapped. Sit down, counselor. Next came the recordings, Grayson bragging to his buddies at a bar about teaching lessons to disrespectful citizens. Then the damning emails with De Leon. Finally, the clincher, the Jenkins kid testifying how Grayson had paid him $50 to make that fake 911 call. Through it all, the veteran sat stone-faced. He'd seen it before in the pre-trial meetings. What interested him more was the jury, an elderly black woman wiping tears, a young Latino man gripping his knees so hard his knuckles whitened, a middle-aged white woman mouthing, "Oh my God," over and over. When the prosecution rested, Grayson's team called exactly one witness, a so-called use of force expert, who droned on about split-second decisions and perceived threats. The jury looked about as convinced as if he'd claimed the earth was flat. Then it was time for victim impact statements. The veteran helped his wife stand, steadying her as she approached the podium. She still moved carefully, her healing abdomen wrapped tight under her dress. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. That night, she began, I was making tea. Chamomile. My husband had gone for a walk after our argument. I was thinking about how to apologize. She touched her stomach absently. Then the door exploded open, and my life became pain and blood and terror. She looked directly at Grayson. You took more than my health. You took my sense of safety in my own home. You made me afraid of police sirens. Of knocking sounds. Of my own shadow. Her voice hardened. But you didn't break me. And you didn't break my husband. As she returned to her seat, the veteran rose. He didn't need notes. I served 12 years in the army, he said simply. Followed orders. Respected the chain of command. What I saw that night wasn't law enforcement. It was a predator with a badge. Grayson flinched like he'd been struck. The veteran continued. I don't want vengeance. I want this man never to carry a gun or a badge again. I want the system that protected him held accountable. And most of all, his voice caught just slightly. I want my wife to sleep through the night without nightmares. When he sat down, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed affected, adjusting her glasses before speaking. Does the defense have any closing remarks? Grayson's lead attorney stood, opened his mouth, then seemed to think better of it. No, Your Honor. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts, the foreperson announced: assault with a deadly weapon, deprivation of civil rights, conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice. The judge immediately revoked bail. As marshals led Grayson away in cuffs, he finally looked back at the veteran. There was no anger now, just hollow fear. The veteran held his gaze until the doors swung shut behind him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Reynolds handled most of the questions while the veteran shielded his wife from the jostling crowd. Just as they reached their car, a familiar voice called out. Mr. Johnson? Chief Walsh stood awkwardly at the edge of the scrum, hat in hands. A word? Reynolds moved to intercept, but the veteran waved him off. Say what you came to say. The chief swallowed hard. The department, we failed you. Failed this community. He looked at the veteran's wife. Ma'am, no apology can undo what happened. But we're implementing new training. Body cams always on. Independent reviews of all. Save it, the veteran said. Not harshly, but firmly. Do the work. Then we'll talk. As they drove away, his wife laid her head on his shoulder. Think he meant it? The veteran watched the courthouse shrink in the rearview mirror. Doesn't matter. We'll be watching either way. That night, for the first time in months, they slept in their own bed. The living room carpet had been replaced, the bullet hole in the wall patched. Some scars remained, but they'd fade with time. The veteran lay awake long after his wife's breathing evened out. Outside, a car rolled slowly past their house. For a second, his muscles tensed, old instincts die hard, until he recognized Hayes at the wheel, giving him a subtle nod before driving off. Standing watch. He smiled in the dark and finally closed his eyes. Justice wasn't perfect. It wasn't always pretty. But tonight? Tonight, it was enough.